Welcome back all, I'm Dazzy J from Model Techniques. This week we got Geoff BUNZA from Portland, Oregon. His specialty is animation on model railroads using Arduino and Raspberry Pi. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment below. Also, I've got a Patreon page. Thanks for a big shout out for all my Patreons out there and super fans. Every little bit helps to keep the content rolling. So without further ado, let's get started. Up and running is MRT scale print. So if you want Craftsman quality 3D printed prints, email me below. What we might have a quick look at now, dynamometer, car recording, which does the drawbar pull, the track voltage, the speed and distance. So tell us about how that sort of all came about, because obviously this is another one of your little projects.
Yeah, a little project that's still going on, believe it or not. And I actually have committed to make it go on. I'm going to have to debate whether I'm going to tell you what the next step is, because you're really going to think I flipped out and lost my mind. Okay, so what this was all about was I had gotten a hold of an old, I'm trying to remember the manufacturer. There was a manufacturer that in like 1957 or 56 made something that was a dynamometer car. They called it a dynamometer car. And it's a picture of it's in the article. And they had this little spring pointer that was displayed in the open door of a baggage car. And they had it hooked to a coupler in an incredibly bad way, such that when you, there it is, that's the DeVore. That's it right there. And you can see the little round thing in the door of the baggage car. And that actually has a little needle pointer that would turn based on the pull of a spring on the coupler. It was terrible. It barely moved the pointer. But it got me thinking, and which is, of course, a dangerous thing. And I kept thinking about, it'd be really cool if you could measure the drawbar pull for real. How would you go about doing that? And I wasted, I don't know how many months with different kind of spring measurement units to try to mimic a much better version of that little indicator. And decided that was an incredible waste of time, and discovered that there were different ways of measuring the weight or the tug, the pull. And there are at least 2 or 3 different kinds of sensors, and I love sensors. And one of them is a sensor that, and there it is. This is called a strain sensor. And you can see in the top right of the picture that bar. Well, there are 4 wires that are attached to the middle of that bar under that white pad. And those wires actually, believe it or not, can measure the change in resistance of the bar. And this is still hard for me to believe, as the bar twists and deforms. Right now, you don't ever see that. However, it's so minuscule and the strain is so real that if you have the right electronics and the right amplifier, you can actually detect the strain that's on that bar. And what does the strain come from? Well, that bar came out of a little postal scale. So that bar was capable of measuring like a half a pound to a couple of pounds, or actually less than that, an ounce to a couple of pounds. So I ripped it apart, like all great believers in learning about things by ripping them apart. And sure enough, got the electronics, got the Arduino, rigged it up, and lo and behold, I can measure a half an ounce or even less. And there's a calibration procedure you got to go through and everything else. And there's the in your picture, that's the insides of the electronics to the dynamometer car. And you might not recognize that little orange Arduino, but that's not an Arduino. It's actually something called a Motino. And a Motino is the equivalent of an Arduino Pro Mini, but it has a little RF transmitter receiver on it that's built into it. And there's a small company in the States here that manufactures them. And I had played with them for a while and got it to work with a battery powered diesel that I wrote an article for Model Railroad Hobbyist on just to demonstrate you can make it work. And sure enough, you can have battery powered locos and cars and do all kinds of neat stuff. But that's the insides of it. And that little green board that's sandwiched in those big capacitors, that's actually the board that converts the strain to something that the Motino can actually read. So this evolved into how mechanically can I build the linkage to the coupler where I'm going to measure the strain. How do I couple that back to that strain gauge? And the answer was with a very interesting lever that was milled out to push down on the end of that. And if you look at the bar is actually suspended all the way back to the big brass block that's right there, that's in the middle of the car. And the reason for that is you want to maximize the leverage, because if you maximize the what do they call it, the extension from its mounting point, you're actually going to intensify the strain, what little you're going to put on the bar. So it's all geared to try to maximize the measurement so that you can measure little tiny tugs from a loco that's actually connected to the coupler. And that's exactly what happened. In the article, I think that there was a little, you saw the coupling unit that actually went to the coupler. It's pretty tiny. Keep going. I saw it before. Okay. You had a picture of it.
Right at the other end. There we go. That there.
Yeah. That's the little coupling unit that connects to the a KD coupler. Yeah. I mean, literally, and there's a pivot point, and that little notch actually goes and pulls down on the top of the bar. Yeah. And that's how the drawbar pull is measured. Now, since I had the drawbar pull, I had to figure out how to display it. So on the side of the car, I took an old Athearn baggage car, and in the side of the car where the baggage doors are, I carved out the window and I put a little OLED display in that the Arduino could drive, the Motino could drive. And sure enough, as the car's going around, you could see the readings of the drawbar pull. Well, that was fine, except, when it got to the other end of the track, I'm not going to go running around after it to see, what's going on. But I had the Motino, and I already had the technology and knowledge to use it as a transmitter. So I used it as a transmitter to transmit to another Motino that I set up with a bigger display in a box, and it simply transferred all the readings from the car to the box. And there's the display on the box right there. And on the right, you can see the readings that are on the display on the car, and then the display that's on the box. Now, you'll notice that the box display is a lot more sophisticated. It's actually graphing it. Well, I got looking at that and I said, well, that's kind of cool. What else can I do with that? And the problem that I had was, if there was a problem with the drawbar pull, like what you would actually see if you went over a piece of rough track, the drawbar pull might spike and go up all of a sudden and then down. Well, you had something wrong with the track at that point. Okay. But then you have to answer the question, where is it? Because it's somewhere down, down the pike. And I'm running this train, and I'm gathering all this information. I say, hey, there's something wrong over there. I'd have to stop it, go where the train was. Well, if it's in a tunnel, I'm never going to, really figure that out. So the next thing was, how do you go and figure out where the problem areas are? And the answer was you want to measure distance. And in order to measure distance, you need a tachometer. So around one of the wheels on the car, I glued 4 small magnets that are about a millimeter in size, a millimeter by a millimeter, and put a Hall sensor there that sensed the magnetic catch the magnet. And so every time the wheel turned once, I got 4 clicks out of the sensor. And all I had to do was record time and the number of clicks I got, and I wound up getting distance. If I have distance, a calculation gives me
Mm.
speed. So I now have drawbar pull, distance, and speed. Well, I kept thinking about that, saying, you know, as a model railroader, that's incidental. What I really want to know is what's the track voltage? Because when I have a large enough layout and I have 4 feeders, the track voltage is going to drop, and that's going to actually influence the run much more importantly, much more
Mm.
significantly than a tug because I've got a bad section of track. At least I thought so. Well, it turns out that, and I really have meant to write this up in another article, and I never did. It turns out an Arduino can measure the track voltage of a DCC track easily, at least as accurately as what's that? The fancy DCC voltage measurement
Oh, the
tool.
ramp meter.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, a ramp meter. Um, you can measure it as accurately as a ramp meter. In fact, there's actually a way to give you more information than a ramp meter would give you, although not
Yeah.
current. Ramp meter will give you current
Yeah.
this
Sure.
way. So anyway, I rigged it up so that it would measure the uh, the DCC level, the peak level, uh, where the wheels were. So all I had to do was record that every time I recorded a clock tick, a tachometer tick. And so I wound up with a display, and I think the red is the voltage level,
Yeah.
the top is the drawbar pole, and I think the other is distance. I think that's
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
there. So and then the instantaneous readings are written on the bottom of the display. Now that's a portable device that's battery powered, and literally you carry that around with you. Now, when I saw something weird, or uh, I saw the train moving at a certain location, I also wanted to say, it'd be nice if I had a marker to say, okay, I'm starting the train, or it's going through this wait station, or it's hitting this yard, or whatever, this milepost. So the little red button in the corner simply tells the Arduino to remember the position at that time. And that's a marker. So you can mark any place along the way.
Wow.
Now, would you care to guess where the marker came from originally?
I would have no idea.
The marker, well, if you go and read the rest of the dynamometer car
Yeah.
article, it starts with the real dynamometer car and what happened with it and how it was used.
Yeah. Okay.
And every new engine, every new steam engine that came out, a railroad would either have their own dynamometer car or they'd lease one, and they'd hook it up right behind the new locomotive, and then they would run the locomotive around where they expected to run the locomotive on the real railroad with real
Yeah.
loads, and they would measure the drawbar pull, and they'd measure speed, they'd measure distance, everything that I'm measuring. They would measure the equivalent thing, but they would also measure steam pressure, all kinds of things in the locomotive, temperature at different places around the locomotive. And they would have these cables running from the walkways of the locomotive, the steam locomotive, over the tender and back into the dynamometer car. And they'd have a whole crew with pen recorders measuring and recording all of this stuff, recorder after recorder after recorder. And that's how they would gather all the information. They'd bring it back to the engineering office of the railroad and they'd analyze it. But along the way, they had a guy that was up in the top corner front of the dynamometer car. And he had actually oftentimes a little cupola that he looked out in the front of the locomotive. And if he saw any aberration, he would make a note by writing it down in his journal. And then the guy below would write down the location and distance. So they would track any aberration that was done in the measurement with this note. And that's where the button came from. To, in essence, mimic, hey, I might want to capture some special information. Now, all of that's cute, but to me, it wasn't ultimately useful because there's only a limited amount that I can see on that little display. And if I have a long run around a large layout, it goes off of the display and I lose all the data on the display that I had before. So how do you deal with that? That led to the next thing, which was get another little Motino, have the transmitter inside the car. I'm sorry, not inside the car, inside the box. Have it record everything on a little micro SD card. So the receiver inside the box gets it from the transmitter. It's recording all the data, regardless of what's on the screen. It only fits on the screen what it's able to fit and keeps going. So you take the micro SD card, you read it into your computer, and I had set up an Excel spreadsheet and explained, okay, all of this is already formatted in a text file. You simply copy the text file, you drop it into this cell in the Excel spreadsheet, and it automatically generates those graphs for the entire run.
Wow.
And because it's Excel, it doesn't have any bound on how many data points you have. And you can also expand and look at each individual data point and what it is compared to all the others. And it'll give you everything. It gives you speed, distance, voltage on the track, and drawbar pull. So the blue in that, I think the blue is drawbar pull.
Speed. Blue is
speed.
Blue is red.
Is the okay? The red is probably voltage. You see that drop in the middle?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's an indicator that you've got a dirty track or you've got a joint that's too big.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it completely dropped out for that period of time, which was probably 1 or 2 tachometer ticks. So you can derive everything from that you wanted to derive. And, I don't know what you would do with it, but you can make other calculations too. And that's how it got to the diagram.
Fantastic.
And of course, it was a little overwhelming to some of the readers.
It's rather overwhelming to me. I think my head's starting to hurt after that, which is not all that difficult, but unbelievable.
However, some people did try to build it, including at least one gentleman in Australia.
Yeah. How'd that go for him?
I never found out.
Unbelievable. So where we might go next is I posed a question on the Arduino, Model Railroad Arduino site on Facebook. I'm just saying that I was going to have a chat with you coming up if there's any burning questions people had, and I sort of cherry picked some of them. So the first one, Nick Santo.
Can I add one thing for you? You didn't ask me the leading question there, Yaz. What's next? I told you it wasn't a finished project. So what's the one thing that a model railroader would like as this thing ran around his railroad besides the things that it measured? You think of one last
Probably
thing?
Sound.
So one thing that people
you would have some sort of sound, I would think. No?
Nope.
Moving figures inside?
Nope.
Enlighten.
It's a measurement. It's the measurement.
You've stumped me. You've got me there.
The distance between the rails.
Right. Okay.
If you knew the precise distance between the rails, if you could measure that and plot it, then you'd know where you're out of gauge, either too wide or too low.
Right. Okay. And that's what you're
Anyway,
currently working on.
that's where I've been working on and off for the last year and a half. I figured out a way to do it, but I haven't implemented it.
Which is quite interesting considering
Okay, fine.
reiterations. You said, "Oh, it's taken me a month," and you're saying that's taken you a long time. So a year and a half. I shudder to think what you're doing in the background there. But maybe for episode number 3 or 4, we may touch on that. Yeah. So as I said, I posed a question of that. I'm going to have a lovely chat with you again. Any burning questions now? Nick Santo, I don't know if you know Nick Santo from Nick's Trains and Things. He does the Dakota Buddy.
Yep,
He wanted to
yep,
personally
yep.
thank you for the inspiration, because obviously the inspiration behind the Dakota Buddy was from yourself. So that's I've had Nick on here before, nickstrains.com. I'll put a link below. Really lovely gentleman. That's
Yes,
He just wanted to say
yes.
thank you for helping him out with the Dakota Buddy. And I don't know if you know of a chap called Neil Erickson. He lives in Hawaii.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
know. We've
yeah.
corresponded.
He Dead Rail is his thing. I've had him on the show, well, probably over a year ago as well. So his question is a practical question. To add a DC decoder, so this would be rather large job, depending on the size of your layout. Adding a DCC decoder every freight car to provide info about load and destination, or consist with train to provide feedback with the engine in regard to the simulated mass and momentum and inertia. Let me read that again. Neil Erickson, is it practical to add a DCC decoder to every freight car to provide information about load and destination, or consist with a train to provide feedback to the engine and in regards to simulated mass? So I think what he's saying is there, so adding a decoder to every freight car which gives you information about its load. So what he means by load is if it's loaded or unloaded, so it gives you a physical weight, which then affects the way the locomotive may run. So that the heavier the locomotive, the longer it takes to get going, the longer it takes to slow down, I think is what he's getting at there. So
Yeah, he's probably looking to change the parameters of the decoder driving the
yeah,
consist or the locomotive, depending on whether it's
yeah,
one or
yeah,
more. Um, uh, he's not going to like this. The answer is yes, um, but I wouldn't do it with the
yeah.
decoder. Uh, Too much electronics that's not needed. What you well, there's two major problems. Okay, each car has to somehow, uh, when it's added to the consist, change the load. So the car itself probably needs to be parameterized to have a different load,
Mm,
and it needs to get that information to the
mm,
decoder. The decoder, and I'm going to go back to that in a second. The decoder itself obviously can't be a current one of the current commercial
yeah,
decoders because why did the IDEC series of decoders occur? They occurred because decoders don't take inputs
yeah,
except for cam chuff. Um, so there's no way to get the input into the decoder. So you'd have to come up with a new kind of decoder that has some kind of parameter that it'll read or you can input to it to change in effect, the way it operates based on the load. The way that I would do it, and yeah, I think it can be done, is I would look at the load of cars in the train as basically needing to tell the car in front of it what its load is. The car in front of it would add its load to it and pass it on to the car in front. And the reason I would do it that way, it would be the same for all cars, right? Once you've figured out how to do that basic operation, then you could put it in any car, you could put it on the train in any order, and they basically would assimilate themselves into the train, and the car right behind the locomotive would then have the net sum of the load on the train, which would then require it to pass it to the locomotive, presumably in the same
Mm.
way. The way that I would probably do it is optically. I'd probably do it with an infrared transmitter because you can get them and make them cheap. Um you can operate them in a burst, low power, so you don't need a lot to make it happen. Um, but I think it could be done. You'd have to have a way to pass the information from car to car to car, and I think that that's doable. But using a decoder in any variation, I think is
Yeah,
overkill. It's
yeah,
just
yeah.
not needed.
I know. I run a program called Train Controller, which is a German software that runs the where you can load each individual car into a consist, and you actually add weight to it. So the computerization of it controls the decoder within the locomotive, which gives it weight, which simulates longer braking time, longer acceleration, just purely on that, but not it's going as far as putting electronics in anything. That's for sure. So
Yeah, you'd almost have to take all of the fancy controls out of the decoder and have the controller control the
yeah,
speed
yeah, yeah,
precisely. So the momentum that would be inherent that everybody put into the decoder, you'd actually want that calculation to be in whatever the speed
yeah,
controller was.
sure,
But yeah, you could do it that way
yeah,
too. Um, Interesting way to do it. That way you wouldn't require anything but a stripped down decoder in the
yeah,
locomotive. You'd still need a way to assimilate the total load of the
yeah,
train. That possibly could be done with some kind of scanner of the train going out of the yard
yeah,
initially. And then once you got the total number of cars, you can make some deduction about what the load
sure,
was and figure that into the train
yeah, yeah,
controller. That might be doable. That's a
yeah,
reasonable way.
cool. All right. The other one, a few people come up with this idea. Well, not an idea, but sort of more of a your input. So we talked a lot about different sketches and different people doing different things, and this would require a body or one person to deal with this, which would be quite laborious, I would think. But is there a way forward to have whether it's one or more repositories for sketches to go? Just people are interested in your thoughts on that side of things, because obviously it requires someone to do a lot of work in the back end, I would think, to be able to collate all these sketches in one or more places.
Yeah, I mean the basic mechanics uh, can be done on GitHub
Yeah,
or any of a number of sites where you can build libraries and store them. Um, I would say that there are incidental problems
yeah,
along the way. Um, you've already alluded one, somebody's got to do the
yeah,
work, but the work itself is not just accepting the sketches and sticking them in, although I suppose that's one way to do it. Um, if I were a modeler, I'd want to know, does the thing actually work?
mm,
How do you connect it up? How do I modify it if I want to modify it or tweak
yeah,
it? At least tweak it. Um, uh, and before you get to that point, I'd say that the other problem that you've got uh, is twofold associated with the infinite variety
mm,
of sketches. One is, what did these things actually run
yeah,
on? What's the configuration? Like if they run on an Arduino Uno, will they run on a Teensy
mm,
3.2? Will they run on a Due? Um, and are you going to test them? And the testing is the last
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
And mostly the biggest pain in the butt is what are you going to do about checking
yeah,
them out?
yeah,
Uh, one of the things that's complained about the NMRA quite a bit is they issue these so-called conformance certificates, and then people go and use them, and well, they don't really conform the way they think they conform. It's and if somebody submits a sketch and it's their favorite sketch that's near and dear to their heart, and you tell them it doesn't work and therefore we're not going to put it in the repository, then you're the bad guy. And who wants to be the bad guy for the world? If it's just a collection place, if it's a a big sketch dump, then you get what you pay for. You're probably going to get a bunch of garbage that's in it.
Yeah.
I think it's an admirable idea. It's been proposed by actually a friend of mine in New Zealand, but nobody seems to have taken up the charge, mostly because it's a heck of a lot of work.
I won't be putting my hand up for it.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example with my stuff. I get asked all the time, can I take your stuff and modify it? And I say, sure. But once you modify it, it's basically your problem.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not going to go and try and debug somebody's oddball collection of circuits and sketches. Just a big time sink. And if you don't have the material in front of you to boot, it becomes a difficult big time sink.
Sure.
So it's problematic for a lot of reasons.
Sure.
I wish it weren't, but I don't have a good way out of it.
I sort of agree, but an interesting conversation point anyway, that's for sure. So moving forward with it, but nothing that unless an arm of people want to, and then obviously there's different steps along the way. There's the making sure they actually work, and then if there's new iterations, how is everything catalogued for the versions and everything in between. So
I could give you an example of that I've been struggling with the last 3 days, and that is libraries that are supposed to work on different versions of Arduinos and don't.
Sure.
And then the combination of two libraries working simultaneously is problematic. It's a can of worms, and a lot of the time they're very difficult problems to try to diagnose. They're filled with subtleties.
Sure.
And the worse documented they are, the worse it is to try and figure them out.
Definitely. All right, Geoff, this has been yet again another lovely conversation. There's a lot in there that I might need to go and rewatch myself to actually fully understand exactly what you're talking about, because, as I said, I'm a microprocessor Arduino base very early on in my career using it and trying to understand it. So just to chat with someone like you again with the amount of knowledge that you're freely giving up is just fantastic. So thank you so much for chatting with me today or tonight.
You're very welcome, and ask lots of questions. That's how we all learn.
Definitely. Thank you very much again.
You're welcome.
Make sure you subscribe, click that little bell icon to be notified of upcoming videos. Support us on Patreon, like us on Facebook and Instagram at Model Railroad Technique.